The situation would deteriorate by stages, with food, fuel, water, and electricity shortages worse than during World War I. In late 1982, there was a widely circulating rumor that bread was deliberately held in the bakeries for 24 hours before selling, so it would become stale, and the population would buy less. The local joke of the era? If only the Russians had invaded, then we would get to eat like the Czechs and get passports like the Hungarians. By the middle of the decade, the buses would no longer run on diesel, but on the much cheaper and more dangerous methane gas with tanks attached to the roofs. I had chosen the Hotel Muntenia on Strada Academiei from a budget guide. It was downtown and cheap enough, less than $25 per night. All I can remember about the room was that it was brown, with one bare light bulb, with a common toilet and shower at the other end of a yawning and drafty hallway. I turned on the black and white television, speeches of the leader interspersed with folk dancing. The room had a phone with a corroded cord, which required going through the hotel switchboard. In such mournful surroundings, I began to feel liberated from my previous life. "Of course, you can come in tomorrow for a briefing, and maybe we can get you in to see the ambassador," a friendly and welcoming second secretary or other at the U.S. Embassy told me over the phone, as if lightening all the brown in my room. I had suddenly gone from being a nobody in a crowded journalistic field in Jerusalem to a person with more status simply by showing up in this Cold War backwater. "You're staying at the Intercon, aren't you?" she asked. My reply was nervous and non-committal. The coming years would be about perfecting the technique of, so to speak, interviewing the Prime Minister while staying at the youth hostel. The next morning I walked past the dirty cream-and-white run-of-the-mill modernist hulk of the Intercontinental Hotel, towering upward in a half-arc, completed in 1970, and the epitome of luxury in late communist Bucharest. Behind the hotel lay Tudor Arghezi, the street named for the inexhaustible 20th-century poet and writer whose literary aesthetic and prodigious modernity had managed to survive communist rule. Here, the white and steep-roofed Baroque mansion that housed the U.S. Embassy was located. Inside, the gleam of tooled dark wood, the neat, state-of-the-art file cabinets and photocopy machines of the era, and the strict Washington dress code of the occupants made for what in my eyes then was a pampered atmosphere of safety, elegance, and efficiency, an extraterritorial refuge from the prison-yard surroundings in nearby streets. I remember the mansion fondly, because I was instantly embraced by a team of diplomats who entrusted me with not only their analyses, but their frustrations. They treated me as a professional journalist, a small but crucial revelation, since in Israel I always felt that my professionalism was suspect because I was a freelancer and a member of the local armed forces, and therefore prone to be sympathetic to the right-wing nationalist government of the day. On repeated visits to Bucharest in the 1980s, I would be reduced to relying on Western diplomats. The sheer terror that ordinary Romanians felt about confiding anything substantive to a foreign journalist, as well as the unwillingness of communist officialdom to venture much beyond propaganda, left one with few alternatives. The Securitate or secret police were seemingly everywhere. The Romanian officials I did manage to interview would actually say such things as, "We never promised our people a rose garden," or, quoting President Nicolae Ceausescu, "We are making the passage from the bourgeois landlord society to the multilaterally developed socialist society." While after 1989 the U.S. Embassy in Bucharest was an afterthought for a correspondent, before 1989 it was the central dispatch point for information and analysis on what was happening in this pulverized, half-forgotten country. Here, along with the American embassies in Sofia, Belgrade, Budapest, and so on, I received briefings remarkable for their insight, lucidity, and unsentimentality that, nevertheless, did not undermine an overarching idealism. For in that white Baroque mansion, I met an American diplomat and Balkan area specialist, Ernest H. Latham, Jr., who had made it his passion to collect the memoirs and other writings of visitors to Romania prior to the onslaught of the Communist Ice Age. His point was that, by preserving the memoir of a pre-communist past, one would be able to conceive of a future beyond communism. In the early and mid-1980s, when Ceausescu's Romania bore the mood of Stalin's Russia, and the paramount assumption of the age was that the Cold War had no end, this was the best sort of prophecy. The Cold War in the Balkans and Central Europe was a golden age for Western embassy reporting. In such settings I began to live history as it happened, at a time when none of these capitals were journalistically fashionable, for this was the decade of Beirut, Managua, San Salvador, and Peshawar, with the media preoccupied with wars in Lebanon and Central America, and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan. I then began acquiring the habit of separating myself from the journalistic horde, looking for news in obscure locations, that is. For example, on a later trip to Bucharest in 1984, Latham casually told me that Ceausescu was blasting a vast area of the capital into oblivion, with security forces plundering and then blowing up whole neighborhoods of historic Orthodox churches, monasteries, Jewish synagogues, and 19th-century houses. 10,000 structures in all, many with their own sylvan courtyards. Residents were given hours to clear out with their life possessions before explosive charges were set. The blast site, where an austere Stalinist-style civic center and apartment blocks were to be built, was being called Ceausescu by Romanians brave enough to talk to foreign diplomats. Latham, who had seen the plans for the new party complexes and ceremonial avenues, compared it to something Albert Speer might have designed for Adolf Hitler, had the 1,000-year Reich become reality. When I revealed what was happening in a magazine article a few months later, I was made persona non grata in Romania for 5 years, until Ceausescu fell. In neighboring Bulgaria in the mid-1980s, another American diplomat told me that, by the way, the communist regime was forcing all 900,000 ethnic Turks, 10% of the Bulgarian population, to change their names to Slavic equivalents, even as mosques were being closed and the Turkish language forbidden. In 1984, yet another American diplomat, Dan Fried, this time in Belgrade, strongly recommended that I henceforth concentrate my energies on Yugoslavia, where, as he put it, ethnic, political, and economic divisions were worsening, and therefore, this country has a great future in the news. The 1980s, which professionally began for me that first morning at the U.S. Embassy on Tudor Arghezi, would constitute an onrush of current events, primarily in the Balkans, that I had more or less to myself, save, of course, for the relatively small number of dedicated foreign correspondents based in capitals like Vienna and Warsaw, themselves struggling to get their own stories prominently placed and appreciated in the face of more cinematic events in the Middle East and Central America. In all of Eastern Europe, only Poland, because of solidarity, martial law, and the Polish Pope, figured prominently in the headlines. Passion was usually lacking in my freelance dispatches, sent by airmail with self-addressed return envelopes, using post offices and occasionally diplomatic pouches. The facts alone were sufficient to communicate the extent of the nightmare, to which an air of unreality frequently hung. On one occasion, I even saw the tyrant close up at a Communist Party Congress. He had stridden up to the podium, and the 4,000 party members in attendance rose to their feet, chanting loudly, "Ceausescu! Ceausescu!" The tyrant, his chin jutting forth, watched impassively for a full 3 minutes with his wife, Elena, beside him. Then he slightly raised his arm in a gesture vaguely reminiscent of a Hitler salute, the sight of which immediately silenced the great hall. Standing directly below a giant picture of himself, he began a speech interrupted 5 times, each time by several minutes of hand-clapping and chants of "Ceausescu! Ceausescu!" until he silenced them. He spoke for a full 90 minutes about socialist economics. After a break, he would speak for a further 90 minutes on socialist theory and ideology. The faces in the audience looked terrified throughout. Nobody dared stop clapping and chanting until he raised his arm. I learned how to be a journalist in Bucharest. Not all at once, not always intentionally, and again, not altogether consciously. For Bucharest in 1981 was not only powerful at first sight, but powerful in retrospect as the years went on. I would ponder Bucharest often as a reaction to the books I later read. Learning to be a journalist happened as much in reflection as it did in real time. By learning to be a journalist, I do not mean learning the commonplace but crucial mechanics of accurate note-taking, news writing, or developing sources, which I had been taught in elementary form earlier in college and at a small newspaper. Instead, I refer to understanding the true character of objectivity. For what is taught in journalism schools is an invaluable craft. whereas properly observing the world is a matter of deliberation and serious reading over decades in the fields of history, philosophy, and political science. Journalism actually is not necessarily, whatever the experts of the profession may claim, a traditional subject in its own right. Rather, it is a means to explore and better communicate subjects that are, in fact, traditional areas of study. History and philosophy, as I've said, but also government, politics, literature, architecture, art, and so on. I've never altogether trusted what journalists say about themselves. As Robert Musil, the great early 20th century Austrian novelist, observes, high-mindedness is the mark of every professional ideology. That's why the image of a profession in the minds of its practitioners is not too reliable. Thus, journalism schools have the particular responsibility of looking at their profession from the vantage point of outsiders. Reading history and political philosophy more and more as I got older, in the course of reporting from all over the world, taught me that a journalist simply cannot be expected to predict the distant future, or even the exact details of the near future. That is impossible, for so much depends not only on impersonal forces like geography and technology, but on the actions of individuals, themselves motivated often by the disfiguring whirlwinds of passion. However, a journalist, through his or her own observations, might be expected to make the reader measurably less surprised by the events to come in a given place within the space of a few years, the middle-term future. And the journalist's ability to do that, however imperfectly, is only made possible by being cruel-hearted. Truth is the successful effort to think impersonally and inhumanly, writes Musil in The Man Without Qualities. Truth arises when the blood is cold. He suggests that a banker is more dependable than an angel because the desire for money preserves objectivity more than love. Thomas Mann concurs, writing in Tonio Kröger, "It is all up with the writer as soon as he becomes a man and begins to feel." I learned the value of such advice in part because of my raw reactions to Bucharest in 1981. Bucharest taught me that while a journalist perpetually seeks out people for information and insights, he must also embrace solitude in long walks in distant cities. I would deeply empathize with all categories of people over the decades, with Romanians especially throughout the Cold War, even openly sympathize when I was purposefully intent on showing readers the world from their point of view. But I also knew that while empathy helps, sympathy can distort. A journalist should be less concerned with outcomes, tragic or not, than with getting the analysis right. A journalist can never shade his observations for the sake of some imagined result. Outcomes are the responsibility of the policymaker, not the journalist. For however moral and uplifting the policy is, it must be based on a realistic assessment of the facts on the ground. Thus, a journalist must be a polite person who asks rude questions, leading sometimes to unsettling observations about both groups and individuals, the very questions and observations that may make one unwelcome at the dinner table and at some fancy conferences. The real difficulty with journalists, and here I refer specifically to foreign correspondents, is that they are the ultimate empiricists. They are children of the moment, with experiences so intense that in their minds the entire universe depends on the fate of those about whom they write, to such an extent that what they don't experience firsthand, even such history that might put their own adventures into perspective, is relegated to the back of their minds, to the lower paragraphs as it were, especially if the local history implies something enduringly heartrending. As for the rest of the world, where equally serious dilemmas exist, and where action is also morally and otherwise demanded, it concerns them not, unless they have been there as first-hand witnesses. So how does one get morally involved while also retaining a heart of ice? How does one describe suffering with the requisite sensitivity while not caring at the same time? Of everything I later read that caused me to reflect back on my 10 days in Bucharest in 1981, nothing solved the conundrum between empathy and objectivity as much as the writing of Joseph Conrad, particularly in his two monumental works, Lord Jim, 1900, and Nostromo, 1904. Conrad's rationalism never gives way to his adventures. His specific achievement is to recreate the overwhelming compactedness of what journalists experience when they are alone in far-off places, in trying circumstances. Yet, because he knows that the record of human experience indicates just how many problems in this world simply have no solutions. His fictional correspondences evince a majestic, godlike objectivity in which humankind is at once loved and deeply pitied. Love is fine, it turns out, as long as one sees it for what it is, an emotion necessary for full-bodied observation, even as that observation will ultimately renounce it. Indeed, Conrad makes you feel that the destiny of the universe depends upon one poor man, or one sick child, while also letting you know the seeming hopelessness of their situation. This is why Conrad could be history's great foreign correspondent, greater than Herodotus even. Because the future lies inside the silences, inside what people are afraid to discuss openly among themselves, or at the dinner table. It is in the guise of fiction that a writer can more easily and relentlessly tell the truth. Such is what I got out of Conrad, partly by way of Bucharest. Romanians and other East Europeans would ultimately have to liberate themselves. That, in the spirit of Conrad, was the hopelessness of their situation, even as the fact that they would ultimately do so years later vindicated the idealism of the American diplomats I knew. Despite Mr. Toyu's warning, I visited several foreign embassies for briefings. The Israeli embassy was off Strada Plantelor, southeast of the city center. It was in a villa that resembled a small and grim castle, on a section of street that for obvious security reasons was uninhabited. A block away was a set of barricades patrolled by Romanian militiamen, armed with assault rifles. After a body search, the Romanians allowed me to proceed to the embassy compound, where I passed through a series of locking doors, before arriving in a waiting room with 2 one-way mirrors and insipid posters about holidays in Israel. A voice through a microphone told me to stand up facing the mirror, then slip my passport through a steel slot. I was now on Israeli territory, and as someone holding Israeli nationality, it should have been my Israeli passport that I presented. When I pushed my American passport through the slot, I knew I was crossing another, small psychological divide. The passport came back through the slot. Another locked door opened, and I proceeded through an undersea-like labyrinth of corridors coated with white tiles, through a curtain, on the other side of which I met an Israeli diplomat who would give me my briefing. His office was lined with undressed stone, like a bunker. The diplomat was about my age, perhaps a bit older, with premature gray hair. He gushed with friendliness. He seemed honored that an American reporter had asked him for a briefing on a subject other than Romanian Jews. I flashed back to where I had been, what I had been wearing, and what language I had been speaking the week before. Israel was already deep in my past. At least it seemed at that moment. In Israel, I had been someone passing through, in the military merely for an adventure, not integrated into the society in a profound enough way, and not intending to be. But here, in communist Romania, I felt that I was finally beginning to do what I always was meant to do. The briefing was the least informative I received from any foreign diplomat in Romania. Unlike the Americans, French, British, and West Germans, he was unwilling at any juncture to criticize the Ceausescu regime. The reason was obvious. The Israelis were in Romania, their only outpost in Eastern Europe, on the whim of a tyrant who was using his official ties with Israel to wheedle trade concessions out of the West, while being guilty of the worst human rights violations in the Warsaw Pact. The embassy's security arrangement and the tight-fistedness of the diplomat's briefing were proof of this. The Israelis could be thrown out at any moment, and the diplomat was not going to risk it for the sake of being honest with a young reporter. But people have to line up before dawn just to buy stale bread. I pleaded with him. Yes, but in this part of the world, you know, people are used to waiting in lines. It's in their culture. In grandiose moral terms, his reply was pathetic. In terms of Israel's self-interest and difficult geopolitical position, his reply was merely awkward. For a price, Ceausescu was permitting Romanian Jews to leave the country. Protecting that process constituted a morality in and of itself. Having removed myself from Israel to this bleak and emotionally neutral terrain, where I barely knew anybody, I was better able to fathom Israeli logic. It was both a revelation and an inspiration to feel so intellectually alive, simply because I was alone, with no emotional attachments to this place, with no personal stake in its destiny. Lucian, in the 2nd century, indicated that a true observer has to be, in his writings, a foreigner, without a country, living under his own law only. In Israel, I often listened to my Jewish friends attack some of the foreign correspondents in Jerusalem for being tacitly pro-Palestinian, mainly because the correspondents were outsiders who had no investment in Israel's present or future, and therefore could not profoundly comprehend Israel's degree of endangerment. In Romania, I instinctively grasped how those foreign correspondents in Jerusalem, whom my friends had criticized, were merely trying to strike a balance between two warring peoples, how they benefited emotionally and intellectually precisely by not having a stake in the outcome. Romania might have been a news backwater, and Israel a place where news was constantly happening, but that's not how I experienced it. Romania was the Cold War, the signal conflict of the age, whereas the Arab-Israeli crisis was but a critical sideshow of it. My mind reeled back to those long lines for bread and fuel, with the colors of people's faces and clothes, and the surrounding sky and buildings all reduced to the 2 shades of gray in a photo negative. Sometimes I saw people sitting on the sidewalk, in the cold, waiting in front of shops whose shelves were empty, following rumors of a forthcoming delivery of meat, eggs, or cheese. People waited in shifts, sometimes all night. They shivered. And it was only early November. At least my hotel room, for all its dinginess, was heated. Not so in the case of many apartment blocks. In terms of human suffering, Romania was the ideological front line between communism and capitalism. This was the history with which my time on Earth corresponded. As Mann writes in The Magic Mountain, a man lives not only his personal life as an individual, but also consciously or unconsciously the life of his epoch. 3 years before, in 1978, I had been on the peninsula of Mount Athos in Greece, where I heard that the Soviet Union and its empire would collapse, and do so in my lifetime. 2 young Russian-American seminary students I had met at the Bulgarian monastery of Zografo, whom I accompanied on a hike to the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimon, spoke to me of the greatness of the Tsars and of the Russian Orthodox Church, and how the Church and the Romanov dynasty were more legitimate than Leonid Brezhnev's communist regime of the day. Because it was godless, the Soviet regime had no moral purpose, and therefore Russia would have to be restored to its true self before long. They had said all this matter-of-factly. Because the Cold War had been in progress since before I was born, I unconsciously assumed its permanence, and so impulsively rejected their